Montana High Line, 1917. Wind howling across open prairie at 50 miles per hour, temperature 35 below zero. While neighbors fought frozen pumps in their standard 12 by 16 foot claim shacks, Carl Peterson was building something they called foolish, a tight log cabin inside an enormous abandoned barn. They laughed at the German-Russian immigrant, called it wasteful. "You're heating 2 roofs," they said. He spent 2 months on what others finished in 3 weeks, setting his 14 by 18 foot cabin 8 feet from the barn walls, creating a dead air buffer around his living space. Then the blizzard hit. 10 days of 45 below zero, winds gusting 60 miles per hour. Standard cabins failed. Interior temperatures dropped to barely 5 degrees despite red-hot stoves. But inside that foolish cabin within a barn, 38 degrees. A 35-degree difference that meant the difference between freezing and survival. What did this immigrant understand about wind, insulation, and heat that everyone else missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Carl Peterson had arrived in north-central Montana 3 months earlier with a wagon full of tools, a head full of memories, and enough cash to last exactly 1 winter if he spent carefully. The railroad advertisements had promised mild Chinook winds and easy farming, but the German-Russian immigrant knew better than to trust sales pitches. He had grown up in a house barn on the Russian steppe, where his grandmother Anna Schmidt had taught him that survival meant building for the worst winter you had seen, not the best winter you remembered. The homestead claim he filed in May 1917 came with an unexpected advantage: a massive timber frame barn left behind by a failed cattle outfit. The structure dominated the prairie landscape, roughly 40 feet by 70 feet, with hand-hewn posts and beams, peg joints, and a roof that had weathered 5 Montana winters without collapse. The siding showed gaps between the planks, and the interior smelled of old hay and abandonment, but the bones were solid. Most neighbors would have seen it as a place to store equipment or shelter livestock. Carl saw it as a fortress against the wind. By late August, while other homesteaders raced to complete their claim shacks before the first snow, Carl was laying out something entirely different. Inside the barn, he marked the footprint for a 14 by 18 foot log cabin, positioning it carefully 8 to 10 feet from the barn's exterior walls. The placement was deliberate, near the leeward side where winter's northwest winds would hit the barn's back wall and spill over, creating a pocket of calmer air around his actual living space. The foundation came first, short stone piers rising 18 inches from the barn's packed dirt floor, supporting a framework of salvaged planks that would serve as the cabin's subfloor. Beneath this platform, he stuffed every available inch with straw and sawdust, primitive insulation materials that cost nothing but labor. The crawl space might have looked crude, but Carl remembered how his grandmother had packed similar materials between the double walls of their step dwelling, trapping still air that held warmth through months of howling wind. The log work began in September, each piece carefully selected from a stand of lodgepole pine he had purchased from another homesteader. The logs measured 6 to 8 inches in diameter, not the massive timbers that marked a wealthy man's cabin, but substantial enough to hold their shape and provide decent mass for heat storage. Carl notched each log with the precision his grandfather had taught him, fitting them so tightly that daylight barely showed through the joints. The chinking came next. Thin wood splinters driven into every gap, then packed with moss, straw, and lime sand mortar mixed according to techniques he had learned watching German-Russian masons work on church foundations back in Kansas. The roof proved the most complex element of the entire project. Carl framed it with 2x6 rafters salvaged from a collapsed shed, creating a low, heavy gable that would shed snow efficiently. Over the rafters went board sheathing, then a layer of tar paper, then cedar shingles he had traded for with a neighbor who needed fence posts cut. The finished roof sat a full 8 feet below the barn's rafters, leaving a substantial airspace above the cabin while ensuring that snow loads would never threaten the inner structure. James Halverson, the established rancher whose opinion carried weight throughout the county, made his first visit in early October. He walked slowly around the construction, shaking his head at what he saw. A cabin inside a barn made no sense to a man who had prospered for 20 years with open-range cattle and minimal winter shelter. "You're heatin' two roofs," Halverson declared, loud enough for the small crowd of neighbors to hear. "That big shell will suck every bit of warmth out of your little cabin. You'll burn twice the wood and freeze twice as fast." Thomas McKay, who was finishing his own 12 by 14-foot claim shack just 2 miles east, joined in the criticism. His single-wall frame house with tar paper siding represented the conventional wisdom: build fast, build cheap, and trust that Montana winters were not as harsh as the pessimists claimed. "Carl's building a hayloft hotel," McKay told his wife Eliza that evening, watching smoke rise from his neighbor's barn. "Mark my words, he'll be in town by January, begging for a room above the mercantile." But Carl continued working, driven by knowledge that went deeper than local convention. In the evenings, he would stand inside his nearly completed cabin and explain the principles to anyone willing to listen. The barn was not a building to be heated, it was a windbreak made of wood, a giant buffer zone that would take the full force of prairie storms while protecting the smaller, tighter structure within. The air trapped between barn walls and cabin walls would act as insulation, just as the down feathers in his grandmother's quilts trapped air to hold body heat through Russian winters. The technical explanation fell on skeptical ears. Most homesteaders had learned their building methods from other homesteaders, passing along techniques that prioritize speed and minimal investment over thermal performance. The idea that still air could be as valuable as thick logs challenged everything they thought they knew about frontier construction. When Carl showed them how he had positioned the single stovepipe to pass through the inner roof and then through a larger metal section where it exited the barn, they saw unnecessary complexity rather than careful fire safety. By November, with the first serious cold settling across the High Line, the social pressure had intensified. Neighbors who had initially been curious now spoke openly about the fool's double house and wagered among themselves how long the German-Russian would last before admitting his mistake. The cabin was finished, smoke was rising from its chimney, and Carl's family had moved in just as the first blizzard warnings appeared in the local newspaper. But the real test was still coming, and everyone knew it. The knowledge that guided Carl's unconventional design stretched back 3 generations to the windswept steppes of southern Russia, where his grandmother Anna Schmidt had learned to build structures that could withstand months of bone-crushing cold. In the German-Russian settlements of Ukraine, survival depended on house barns, massive combined dwellings where families and livestock shared a single roof, their body heat and shared walls creating microclimates that softened winter's assault. Anna had supervised the construction of such buildings, mixing clay and laying sod, raising timber frames that enclosed both human quarters and animal stalls within thick walls designed to stop wind before it could steal precious heat. When Carl was 12, Anna had walked him through their family house barn during a blizzard that buried the settlement for 6 days. She pointed to the double walls filled with straw, the careful positioning of living spaces away from exterior walls, and the way animal heat rose through the structure to warm the loft where children slept. "You never fight the wind," she had told him in German, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived 40 Russian winters. "You make the wind fight something else first, then build your warm place behind that shield." Now, 15 years later and 2,000 miles west, Carl was applying those lessons to Montana's unforgiving climate. The barn shell served the same function as the outer walls of Anna's house barn, not a space to be heated, but a barrier that absorbed the prairie's fury before it could reach the family's actual living quarters. Every morning, he would step from the inner cabin into the barn's dim interior and feel the difference immediately. Where the wind outside howled at 50 miles per hour, the air inside the barn moved gently, buffered by 40 feet of timber and siding that broke the storm's momentum into harmless eddies. The air management system was deceptively simple but critically important. High in the barn's gables, Carl had deliberately left ventilation gaps that allowed the outer shell to breathe, preventing dangerous moisture buildup that could rot the timber frame or create condensation problems. But between the barn's interior walls and the cabin's exterior logs, the air remained largely still, trapped in a buffer zone that physics would later recognize as an effective insulating medium. Dry, motionless air possessed remarkable thermal properties, creating resistance to heat transfer that could rival manufactured insulation when properly contained within an enclosed space. The stove installation had required particular care, since Carl was essentially creating a wood-burning system within two separate structures. He positioned a medium-sized cast-iron box stove near the center of the cabin's main room, estimating its output at roughly 30,000 British thermal units per hour, sufficient to heat the cabin's 252 square feet without overwhelming the space. The stovepipe rose straight through the cabin's roof, then transitioned to a larger diameter metal chimney section before exiting through the barn's roof, maintaining proper clearance from combustible timbers while ensuring adequate draft. Neighbors continued to question every aspect of the design. Niels Andersen, a Norwegian carpenter who had recently completed his own claim requirements, examined the complex flue system with professional skepticism. "That pipe arrangement looks like a fire trap waiting to happen," he commented, though his tone carried more curiosity than condemnation. Unlike the ranchers who dismissed Carl's methods outright, Andersen recognized elements that reminded him of Scandinavian building traditions: the emphasis on tight construction, the careful attention to air sealing, and the strategic use of buffer spaces to moderate interior temperatures. The first serious test came in mid-November, when temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and sustained winds reached 35 miles per hour across the prairie. Thomas McKay, burning fence posts and green wood to keep his claim shack above freezing, watched smoke rise steadily from Carl's barn and wondered aloud how much fuel the double structure was consuming. His own thermometer showed 42 degrees at dawn despite running his stove hard all night, while water in his wash basin had frozen solid by morning. Carl, meanwhile, was conducting his own measurements with the methodical precision his grandmother had taught him. Each morning, he recorded the outdoor temperature, the temperature inside the barn, and the temperature inside the cabin, along with careful notes about wind conditions and fuel consumption. The results were revealing. While his cabin maintained a steady 55 degrees with moderate firing, the barn interior averaged 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outdoor air, creating a stepped thermal gradient that significantly reduced heat loss from the inner structure. The fuel efficiency was equally impressive. Where McKay was burning 3 to 4 armloads of wood per day to maintain barely tolerable conditions, Carl's setup required only 2 armloads to achieve superior comfort. The difference lay not in the stove or the wood quality, but in the fundamental approach to heat retention. Instead of trying to warm a structure that leaked heat through every wall and joint, Carl was warming a tight envelope, protected by an outer shell that absorbed wind pressure and reduced convective heat loss. James Halverson made another inspection in late November, this time bringing several other ranchers who wanted to see the contraption for themselves. Walking through the barn's main doors and then into the snug cabin felt like moving through successive layers of protection, each threshold representing another barrier against the prairie's assault. The inner cabin was undeniably warm, comfortable enough that men could remove their heavy coats and work at a table without gloves, a luxury that few claim shacks could provide during Montana's deepening winter. But Halverson remained unconvinced, attributing the performance to temporary factors rather than sound design principles. "Wait until January," he predicted, his breath visible in the barn's cooler air. "When the real cold hits, that big shell will turn into an ice box and suck every degree out of your little cabin. You're just postponing the inevitable." Carl accepted the criticism without argument, though privately he felt the confidence that came from applying proven methods to new circumstances. Anna Schmidt's lessons had prepared him for exactly this kind of skepticism, the resistance that established communities showed toward unfamiliar techniques, even when those techniques had proven themselves across centuries of harsh climate survival. December 1897 had taught Montana ranchers that the territory's climate could shift without warning, from manageable to catastrophic. The Great Die-Up winter had killed entire herds and bankrupted established cattlemen who had trusted in mild seasons and open-range grazing. Now, 20 years later, the signs were accumulating again. Early blizzards in November, unseasonably deep cold settling across the High Line, and old-timers in town speaking quietly about barometric pressure and the behavior of livestock that suggested something worse was building. By mid-December, the contrast between conventional construction and Carl's double shell system had become undeniable to anyone paying attention. Thomas and Eliza McKay were burning through their carefully stockpiled firewood at an alarming rate, stoking their single-wall claim shack every few hours to maintain temperatures that hovered in the high 30s. On calm nights, they could achieve a tolerable 55 degrees, but when prairie winds picked up to 35 or 40 miles per hour, their interior thermometer dropped into the 20s, despite a red-hot stove that consumed fence posts and furniture legs with desperate efficiency. The McKays' experience was typical rather than exceptional. Across the scattered homesteads of north-central Montana, families in standard construction were discovering that their hastily built cabins performed adequately only under ideal conditions. Single-shell log and frame structures with minimal chinking and tar paper siding leaked heat through countless invisible gaps that became wind channels during storms. Even well-built claim shacks suffered from a fundamental design flaw. They presented their living spaces directly to the prairie's assault, with no buffer zone to moderate the convective heat loss that occurred when moving air stripped warmth from exterior walls. Carl's setup was revealing its advantages through simple physics that he understood intuitively but could not articulate in technical language. Each morning, his routine measurements showed his inner cabin maintaining 50 to 55 degrees, with fuel consumption that had stabilized at roughly two-thirds of what his neighbors required. The barn shell was performing exactly as Anna Schmidt's house barn principles predicted, absorbing wind pressure before it could drive cold air infiltration into the living space, while the 8-foot cavity of mostly still air between barn walls and cabin walls provided insulating value that traditional construction could not match. The dead air principle was ancient knowledge that frontier builders had largely forgotten in their rush to meet homestead requirements. Trapped air, when prevented from circulating, resisted heat transfer with remarkable efficiency. Modern building science would later quantify this phenomenon, demonstrating that enclosed airspaces could achieve thermal resistance values comparable to manufactured insulation. Carl's grandmother had understood this relationship without needing scientific explanation. She had simply observed that double walls filled with straw and protected from air movement kept families warmer than single walls of equal thickness. The windbreak effect was equally important and equally misunderstood by Carl's critics. Research that would not be conducted for another 50 years would prove that structures protected by windbreaks consume 20 to 40% less heating fuel than identical buildings exposed to prevailing winds. The barn shell was functioning as a wooden shelter belt built directly around the living space, creating a microclimate where wind speeds dropped dramatically and heat loss through air infiltration was reduced by as much as 75%. James Halverson remained skeptical even as evidence mounted that conventional wisdom was failing across the region. His own ranch buildings, sturdy frame structures built according to established territorial practices, were struggling with the extended cold. Ice formed regularly on interior walls, and his hired men were complaining about sleeping quarters that required constant firing to remain habitable. When he visited Carl's setup in late December, the contrast was obvious, but inexplicable within his framework of understanding. "Must be using better wood," he muttered, unwilling to accept that the design itself might be superior to methods that had worked adequately during milder seasons. Other neighbors were beginning to ask more pointed questions. Niels Anderson, whose carpentry experience gave him appreciation for tight construction, examined the thermal performance with growing interest. He had noticed that his own cabin, built with careful attention to log fitting and chinking, still consumed nearly 3 cords of firewood by Christmas, while Carl's mysterious double structure had burned less than 2 cords for apparently superior comfort. The fuel efficiency suggested principles that Anderson recognized from Norwegian building traditions, where strategic use of buffer zones and air management had evolved over centuries of harsh climate survival. The social dynamics were shifting as winter deepened, and reality contradicted predictions. Men who had openly mocked Carl's hayloft hotel now visited with measuring sticks and practical questions disguised as casual conversation. They wanted to understand the spacing between inner and outer walls. the ventilation system that prevented moisture problems in the barn shell, and the stove installation that seemed to heat both structures without the excessive fuel consumption they had predicted. Carl received these inquiries with quiet patience, explaining his methods without defensiveness or superiority. He showed visitors how the barn doors created an airlock effect, how the inner cabin's tight construction concentrated heating efficiency, and how the buffer zone moderated temperature swings that made other dwellings uncomfortable even when adequately warmed. His pencil-marked record board documented the performance with measurements that spoke louder than theories: consistent interior temperatures, predictable fuel consumption, and thermal comfort that his neighbors were achieving only during the mildest weather. But the real test was still approaching. Weather patterns suggested that January would bring the kind of sustained Arctic outbreak that separated adequate construction from life-saving design. Barometric readings were dropping steadily. Livestock were exhibiting restless behavior that old-timers associated with severe storms, and the quality of light on the northern horizon hinted at the massive high-pressure system that would soon dominate the Central Plains. When that system arrived, the performance differences between conventional single-shell construction and Carl's double-envelope experiment would become matters of survival rather than mere comfort, and the community's mockery would give way to desperate interest in methods that might mean the difference between freezing and staying alive. The storm that would define the winter of 1917 arrived on January 15th without the gradual buildup that usually warned experienced plainsmen. The barometric pressure dropped precipitously overnight, and by dawn, the wind was gusting to 50 miles per hour across frozen ground that offered no resistance to the Arctic air mass sweeping down from Canada. Within 6 hours, the temperature had plunged from a manageable 10 below zero to 35 below, and snow was falling horizontally in sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards. Thomas Mackay discovered the inadequacy of his claim shack before the storm reached full intensity. By noon, with the wind hammering his single-wall frame construction at sustained speeds above 40 miles per hour, his interior thermometer showed 28 degrees despite a stove that glowed red-hot and consumed every burnable scrap he could find. The tar paper siding flapped and tore in places, allowing snow to sift through gaps in the board and batten walls that had seemed adequately tight during milder weather. Eliza wrapped their 2 young children in every blanket they owned and moved them to the floor near the stove, but even there the cold was becoming life-threatening. Across the scattered homesteads, similar scenes were unfolding as frontier construction met forces it had never been designed to withstand. The Andersons' carefully chinked log cabin developed a coating of interior frost that spread from the walls toward the center of the room, while their water bucket froze solid despite sitting 3 feet from a roaring fire. The Halverson Ranch buildings, though larger and more substantial than typical claim shacks, suffered from the same fundamental weakness. They presented their interior spaces directly to wind that drove cold air through countless small openings and stripped heat from exterior surfaces faster than any reasonable amount of fuel could replace it. Inside Carl's barn, the physics of wind and heat transfer were playing out according to principles that Anna Schmidt had understood through hard experience rather than scientific theory. The massive timber frame absorbed the storm's initial assault, dissipating wind pressure across 40 feet of weathered siding before any moving air could reach the inner cabin's walls. Snow accumulated in 8-foot drifts against the barn's windward side, but this natural insulation only improved the structure's performance by adding thermal mass that moderated heat loss. The dead air buffer zone was performing exactly as intended. Between the barn's interior walls and the cabin's exterior logs, the air remained largely motionless despite the chaos outside, creating an insulating barrier that prevented convective heat loss while maintaining temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outdoor conditions. Carl's morning thermometer reading showed the cabin's interior at 41 degrees, cold by modern standards but survivable with proper clothing and bedding, and critically warmer than the sub-freezing conditions that were overwhelming his neighbors' heating systems. The fuel efficiency advantage was now literally a matter of life and death. While families in exposed cabins were burning furniture, fence posts, and green wood in desperate attempts to maintain barely tolerable temperatures, Carl's setup continued to provide adequate warmth with sustainable fuel consumption. His carefully stacked cordwood, which had seemed excessive to observers who favored minimal preparation, was lasting precisely as long as his grandmother's experience had taught him to expect. By the third day of the storm, with outdoor temperatures holding steady at 45 below zero and wind speeds consistently above 50 miles per hour, the first desperate neighbors began arriving at Carl's barn. Thomas McKay appeared just after dawn, carrying his youngest child and leading Eliza through snow that reached their waists. Their cabin had become uninhabitable during the night when interior temperatures dropped below 10 degrees and their remaining fuel ran out. McKay's pride had finally yielded to the reality that his family would not survive another night in conventional construction. The barn doors, which had seemed like an unnecessary complication to earlier visitors, now revealed their function as an essential airlock system. McKay pushed through the first set of doors into the barn's relative calm, where wind speeds dropped to gentle currents and the temperature was 20 degrees warmer than the killing cold outside. The second threshold, into Carl's inner cabin, brought them into a space that felt almost tropical by comparison, warm enough to remove heavy coats, to speak without seeing their breath, to function as human beings rather than survival machines focused solely on avoiding hypothermia. Over the following 2 days, 3 more families sought shelter in what locals had begun calling the barn fortress. The inner cabin accommodated Carl's family plus 1 other, while the barn's loft was hastily arranged with blankets and tarps to shelter additional refugees. The temperature differential was now measurable in stark, life-saving terms: 45 below zero outside, 5 to 10 degrees in the most exposed claim shacks, 38 to 42 degrees in Carl's protected inner cabin. The 35-degree advantage that skeptics had dismissed as impossible was keeping 12 people alive while conventional construction failed around them. James Halverson arrived on the storm's 6th day, his confidence in established methods finally broken by the sight of his own bunkhouse windows, frosted over on the inside, despite constant firing. He found families working by lamplight in Carl's cabin, children playing games instead of huddling for warmth, and adults able to cook meals and maintain normal household routines. The contrast with his own ranch, where hired men were burning furniture to avoid freezing, was undeniable evidence that everything he thought he knew about cold climate construction was dangerously inadequate. The storm finally broke on January 25th, leaving behind a landscape transformed by wind-sculpted snow and scattered evidence of structural failure. Several claim shacks had partially collapsed under snow loads or wind pressure, while others stood intact but had proven uninhabitable during the worst weather. Carl's barn showed no damage beyond cosmetic wear, and his inner cabin had maintained life-sustaining temperatures throughout the 10-day siege without depleting his fuel reserves or requiring the desperate measures that had characterized survival elsewhere. When the rescued families finally returned to assess their own dwellings, the conversation had shifted permanently from mockery to respectful inquiry about methods that had proven themselves under conditions that conventional wisdom could not survive. When the families emerged from Carl's barn fortress on January 26th, they stepped into a landscape sculpted by 10 days of unrelenting wind. Snowdrifts reached the eaves of the barn's leeward side, while the windward face showed the polished, wind-scoured surface that marked structures that had absorbed the storm's full fury without yielding. Across the scattered homesteads, the evidence of structural failure was unmistakable. The Anderson cabin's roof sagged under accumulated snow loads. The McKay claim shack listed visibly where wind pressure had loosened its foundation, and 2 abandoned dugouts had collapsed entirely, where their sod roofs could no longer bear the weight of wind-packed snow. The conversations that followed carried none of the mockery that had characterized earlier discussions of Carl's methods. James Halverson, whose ranch buildings had suffered frozen pipes and interior frost damage despite their substantial construction, approached with the measured respect of a man whose assumptions had been thoroughly defeated by reality. "That airspace between your cabin and the barn wall," he began, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "How did you figure the right distance? Too close, and it wouldn't work. Too far, and you'd lose the benefit." Carl walked the rancher around the perimeter, stick in hand, explaining the principles that Anna Schmidt had taught him without claiming superior wisdom or highlighting others' mistakes. The key was maintaining at least 6 to 8 feet of buffer zone, enough space that air could not circulate freely between inner and outer walls, but not so much that the outer shell failed to provide wind protection. The barn needed a breathe at the top to prevent moisture problems, but the cavity between cabin and barn walls had to remain as still as possible to maximize its insulating value. Thomas Mackay, whose family had survived the storm only because of Carl's hospitality, asked more pointed questions about construction techniques. His own claim shack would require complete rebuilding before the following winter, and he was determined to avoid repeating the design flaws that had nearly cost his children their lives. Could you do this with a granary instead of a barn? He wondered, thinking of the smaller outbuilding that had weathered the storm better than his main cabin. Set a tight little house inside a grain shed? The answer was yes, provided the outer structure was sound enough to serve as a windbreak and large enough to create meaningful buffer zones. Carl sketched the essential requirements in the snow: an outer shell positioned to take the brunt of prevailing winds, an inner dwelling set back from all exterior walls, controlled ventilation to prevent condensation problems, and careful attention to the stove installation that would serve both fire safety and heating efficiency. The specific materials mattered less than understanding the physics of wind protection and dead air insulation that made the system work. Niels Anderson, whose carpentry background helped him grasp the technical principles, was already planning adaptations that would combine Carl's buffer zone concept with traditional Scandinavian building techniques. Within a month, he had begun constructing a tight-frame cottage inside his failing granary, packing straw between the inner and outer walls, and adding controlled vents based on his experience with Norwegian double-wall construction. The hybrid approach, old-world craftsmanship applied to Carl's barn shell innovation, represented exactly the kind of practical evolution that occurred when proven techniques met local needs. By spring, 3 other homesteaders had built versions of the cabin within a building design, adapting the concept to their available structures and resources. One family used an abandoned store building, creating a cozy 2-room dwelling within the commercial shell. Another built a crude but effective lean-to addition around their existing claim shack, creating a buffer zone that improved heating efficiency by 40%. These adaptations represented the organic spread of innovation that characterized frontier problem-solving, not rigid adherence to a single design, but flexible application of sound principles to diverse circumstances. The validation extended beyond immediate neighbors to county officials and territorial building inspectors who had initially questioned whether Carl's double structure met homestead requirements. The performance during the January storm had demonstrated that his innovation exceeded rather than circumvented the law's intentions. Where minimum construction standards aimed to ensure habitability, Carl's methods had achieved superior habitability with comparable material costs and labor investment. The Territorial Agricultural Extension Service began quietly documenting the design for inclusion in building guides intended for new settlers. Margaret Lewis, the county school teacher who would later compile oral histories of early homestead experiences, made her first visit to Carl's barn in April 1918. Her notes described the inner cabin as remarkably comfortable and well-appointed, while emphasizing the practical simplicity of the overall system. She measured the critical dimensions: 40 by 70-foot barn shell, 14 by 18-foot inner cabin, 8 to 10-foot buffer zones, and interviewed neighbors about the winter's experiences. Her records would eventually become part of the Montana Historical Society's documentation of ethnic building traditions that had helped settlers survive the territory's harsh climate. The broader implications of Carl's success reached beyond individual survival stories to questions of building science that would not be formally studied for several decades. Modern research would eventually demonstrate that wind-protected structures could reduce heating energy consumption by 20 to 40%, while properly designed airspaces could achieve thermal resistance values approaching manufactured insulation. The German-Russian immigrant who had never heard terms like thermal envelope or convective heat transfer had nonetheless applied these principles with intuitive precision based on generations of cold climate building experience. By 1920, when homestead filings in north-central Montana reached their peak, Carl's barn within a barn had become a documented example in county extension bulletins that advised new settlers on cold climate construction. The design appeared alongside recommendations for sod houses, dugouts, and other shelter types that prioritize thermal performance over conventional appearance. What had begun as one man's application of old world knowledge to frontier conditions had evolved into recognized best practice for a region where winter survival often depended on understanding the relationship between wind, insulation, and fuel efficiency that mainstream building methods too often ignored.